Good morning, everybody. Can I ask everybody to take their seats, please? I know there's some people being mic'd up there at the back, so you will be excused. Just want to say, to extend, well, first of all, my name is Liam Herlihy. I chair the Teagasc Authority, and my role today is, first of all, is to extend a very warm welcome to all of you today. Just maybe very small bit of housekeeping, just to let you know that today's conference will be recorded. And I would suggest that we all put our phones maybe on silent as well. So I think maybe thinking of that, by having them on silent, it will mean that we will have a full battery tonight when we check out the swing states of Georgia and North Carolina and Pennsylvania and all those great and wonderful things. So today's conference, the whole focus of today's conference is sustainability in agriculture, science and evidence. So with that, please, if you don't mind, Declan, I will ask you just to show a very, very short video for just 2 minutes, please. Thanks for that, Declan. A lovely video to start a conference like this. When I look down and see our audience, it immediately reminds me of Food Vision 2030 when I say and would like to acknowledge the presence of Tom Ireland and many of the participants in Food Vision 2030 that are with us here today, and thanks for joining us. Of course, it was an initiative that was set up by the industry stakeholders and the Department of Agriculture. And the purpose in mind was recognising that Ireland, as a food-producing nation, that we export more than 90% of what we produce. And the whole focus was, of course, to ensure that what we produce is quality product that is produced for a sustainable food system for our many overseas markets. Teagasc, as our research, advisory and education organisation, is absolutely committed to the whole area of sustainability, and it is front and centre of what we do, and that is as it ought to be. And on that note, I think it is important that I acknowledge, the key leadership team in Teagasc for their absolute commitment and focus to making sure that sustainability is front and centre of what we do. I suppose looking at the many challenges and opportunities that are there for agriculture, and oftentimes we tend to focus on the challenges, but there are opportunities there also. And today's focus is where we look at the three pillars of sustainability, and all are of equal importance: economic, social, and environmental. And of course, today's conference will have a specific focus on the whole area of livestock production within the whole area of sustainability. Every conference will have to have a purpose, and the purpose of today's conference is to really delve into the science and evidence that's associated with our sustainability systems. And in so many organisations, you've got so many ideas, so many food for thoughts. But the one thing I would remind us today, and it is something that we've got to be very proud of, is that Teagasc, as an independent, and I stress the word independent, as an independent research organisation, we are ideally placed to be at the forefront of that whole sustainability discussion, innovation and development well into the future. And I think we are, I won't say I think, I know that we are well recognised throughout the globe for that. It is important, of course, before I conclude, before I introduce our director, to acknowledge the many people that have been responsible for creating today's event. I want to acknowledge all of you, because without the people that put all of this in place, it just would not have been possible. So on behalf of all of us, thanks to the organising committee. I want to say thanks to our panellists and speakers who are with us today. Some have not arrived as yet, and I just want to say your presence and the work you've put into today is much appreciated. And I would like to say a very special word of welcome to Dr. Badi Besbes from the FAO, who will give what I would describe as an international perspective and your insights into the whole area of livestock production, and that will be much appreciated today from a global perspective. To get the morning up and running, I want to introduce our Teagasc Director, Professor Frank O'Mara. Frank needs very little introduction, but as you're all aware, he would have been appointed Director of Teagasc just 3 years ago, and prior to that would have been Head of Research for more than 10 years. And it is important to note that Frank's commitment to research and to the whole area of sustainable food production systems were very front and centre of the work he actually did during his research years. I think it would be fair to say that he would have been, long before the word sustainability became a buzzword, Frank's research had that front and centre of all of the work that he was doing. In addition to that, I think it is important to recognise, and I don't want, Frank is a very modest man, but I think it is important that we recognise 4 years ago he was appointed President and Chair of the European Animal Task Force. And for a small country like ours, it was a great honour, first of all, to Frank, to Teagasc, and to our country, that a person of his calibre was asked to chair that, which is a joint initiative between industry and research. And I think that is so important, because one without the other just can make no sense. It is the importance of bringing both together, research and key stakeholders, is where real meaningful progress can develop. And I think no better person to give the opening address and introduce us to today's event, the event of science and evidence. So would you please welcome Professor Frank O'Mara, our Director.
So thank you, Chairman, and good morning, everyone. And you're all very welcome here this morning for this important conference addressing the sustainability of Irish agriculture. So what does sustainability mean? And what do we, lots of people use the word. In Ireland, I suppose, in the context of agriculture, it generally means balancing economic viability, environmental stewardship and social equity in order for agriculture to provide food and nutrition, but also to play a central role in the economy and rural livelihoods. And indeed, the strategy for the industry, the aforementioned Food Vision 2030, aims that Ireland will become a world leader in sustainable food systems. So sustainability, it's a big word, and it can mean different things to different people. And that can often lead to contested claims, to controversies, and sometimes heated discussions. And given the broad concept of sustainability that I just outlined, that's not surprising, because different people will prioritise different aspects of sustainability. But hopefully we can all agree that a truly sustainable system delivers on all three dimensions simultaneously. And the purpose of today's conference is to shine the light of scientific evidence on the sustainability credentials of our agriculture, our dairy and beef in particular as our main sectors, and to see how science can chart a way forward to improving our sustainability. As an independent science-based organisation, Teagasc is well placed to examine and assess the science and the evidence, using not just our own information, but also the evidence from key organisations like the EPA, the Central Statistics Office, the Department of Agriculture, National Parks and Wildlife Service, universities and others. We're also well placed to chart a way forward and to be an effective agent of change and improvement in the sector, because not alone do we just do research, but we also have an advisory service with huge reach to farmers and huge trust among farmers. And we have an education service that is the go-to place for those seeking to enter farming, horticulture and other land-based enterprises. So when we talk about improving sustainability in the sector, what do we mean by sector? Well, the agriculture sector is our farmers, our horticulturalists, our foresters, our food companies, our input suppliers, our service providers, and so on. These are all part of the sector, and we recognise in Teagasc that if we want to influence change, we have to work with all of these in a multi-actor approach. Some people worry about our independence being compromised by working with industry, but I would say that industry are an important part of the agriculture sector, and we can have greater influence and affect greater change by working in partnership with them. We do that successfully, I believe, without compromising our independence, which we hugely value and strongly protect. As the Chairman said, Teagasc is hugely committed to playing our part in improving the sustainability of Irish agriculture through research, advice and education. And by using the word improving, we're acknowledging that it's not currently perfect, albeit I do believe we're in a good starting position, and I will come back to that because I realise some people might challenge that. In recent years, we have greatly increased our resources directed at environmental sustainability. In climate, we have initiated the Signpost programme and the Teagasc Climate Centre, and we have built a world-class sustainability digital support tool called AgNav in partnership with ICBF and Borbia, and delighted to have representatives from both organisations here today. In water quality, we have the Agricultural Sustainability Support and Advisory Programme and the Agricultural Catchments Programme, and recently we launched our new advisory campaign, Better Farming for Water, 8 Actions for Change. In biodiversity, we give huge advisory support to farmers in the acres, participating in the acres scheme, and we have expanded our research and knowledge transfer teams. These additional resources and programmes have been aided through additional funding, mainly from the Department of Agriculture and Food and the Marine, but also the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, Research Ireland, or formerly Science Foundation Ireland, Horizon Europe, the EPA, dairy and pig farmers through levies and industry funding. So we've been able to increase the focus on the environment while still maintaining a very strong focus on economic and social sustainability. Coming back to this idea that we're in a good starting position in Irish agriculture, I do believe that the fundamental building blocks of grass-based ruminant production systems are sound. Firstly, we feed our livestock mainly grass, forage and other byproducts. So we're exploiting the unique ecological niche of ruminants, whereby they can recycle or upcycle human inedible feed into highly nutritious edible food. Secondly, the manure produced by livestock in a grazing system is circled back to most of the land that produces their feed, contributing to good soil health. And thirdly, grass-based systems by their nature are less intensive than high-input confined systems. So in all of these, there is room for improvement. You know, we can have more biodiversity and we need it. We do need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and we do need to improve our water quality. But these basic fundamental tenets of the system do provide a strength, an innate strength to a grass-based system. So in my view, we are in a relatively good starting position, and the journey to greater sustainability has to be about maintaining what's good about our system and improving the weak points. So today in our opening session, our keynote speakers will set out the global and Irish context for the sustainability of livestock systems. And then we'll explore the nutritional value of the food we produce and the drivers of consumer trends and behaviours. We will then move on to unravel the indicators of environmental, economic and social sustainability in Ireland. And we will look at how we support farmers transitioning to more sustainable practices through our education and training programmes. And finally, the panel discussion will provide an important reflection on how we can shape the future of sustainability. So before I finish, I'd like to extend my thanks also to the chairpersons, speakers and panellists who've contributed their time and expertise to make this conference happen, and in particular to our speaker from the FAO who has travelled from Rome to be with us here today. I'd also like to express my gratitude to my Teagasc colleagues for organising this event, and in particular the organising committee chaired by Karen Daly, who have all put a huge amount of work into this conference. Also, the local team here in Ashtown for the local logistics and for the food that we will get during the morning, and our digital media production manager, Declan McCarthy, and of course our corporate communications team who take these messages to the outside world. I'd also like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the many funders that contributed to the scientific research behind some of the papers you will hear today. We do have a very diverse audience from across the agri-food sector and beyond, including some members of NGOs, and you're all very welcome here, and I hope that you enjoy and find this conference useful. So, go míle maith go léir.
Thanks, Director. Just to get us underway, I just want to introduce a video from our Minister for State at the Department of Agriculture and the Marine, Martin Heydon. And unfortunately, Martin sends his apologies because of government business today, he cannot be in attendance. Just in a moment, Declan, you can play that video of introduction from Minister Heydon. But just maybe to put a structure in the meeting rather than I jumping up and down, after the video, I will ask Teagasc's Dr. Siobhán Jordan, who is Director of Commercialisation and Technology Transfer, to come to the podium and to lead the way in relation to the next session, please. So with that, please, Declan, you might lead off with the video from Minister Martin Heydon, to be followed then by Siobhán Jordan. Thanks.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And I begin by extending my apologies for not being with you in person for this important event on the science and evidence underpinning sustainability in agriculture. I want to commend Teagasc for organising the conference and for assembling the excellent lineup of speakers that will address you. Sustainability is central to our 10-year agriculture and food strategy, Food Vision 2030. It is the first strategy that takes a complete approach to sustainability in all of its dimensions. It is a detailed mission dedicated to addressing climate and environment, but equally it pays attention to measures that address economic and social challenges. Agriculture is on the front lines of climate change, but farmers cannot go green if they're in the red. We cannot have a sustainable sector without addressing the three legs of the sustainability stool, namely economic, environmental and social. And there's no future for rural Ireland and no prosperous future for Ireland that does not involve farming, farmers, or the agri-food sector. By working together, we can ensure that farmers can earn a decent income whilst protecting the environment. Of course, one of Food Vision's 4 missions is dedicated to research, innovation and technology. This links directly to the focus of today's conference around science and evidence. This is a significant area of attention for me as Minister of State with special responsibility for research and innovation. My department has committed over €250 million in research funding since back in 2010. We do this because scientific research provides the basis for developing the knowledge and evidence to drive sustainability. In our most recent national research call, €46.5 million was awarded to 41 projects. 40% of that went to research in the areas of climate mitigation and adaptation and agri-environment. This means we are continuing to invest in the science around methane-reducing feed additives, breeding and genetics for low-emitting livestock, low-nitrogen input clover and multi-species swards, soil carbon, sequestration, organic farming, and improving water quality. Many of the technologies and innovations coming out of this work have multiple co-benefits. What is good for the climate is often good for water quality, biodiversity, and overall farm productivity and profitability. Agriculture can and does do more than one thing at a time. I do not buy into the suggestion that we have a binary choice between addressing emissions or guaranteeing food security. It is not a question of being pro-farmer or pro-environment. They are two sides of the same coin. Ireland's leadership in sustainable agri-food systems is made possible through the combined efforts of the sector informed by cutting-edge, high-quality science. Events such as today offer an opportunity to reflect on that science and continue our shared ambition towards achieving truly sustainable food systems. I wish you well in your deliberations today. I thank you for the invitation to speak with you. Apologise once again that I can't be there in person, but I wish you every success today. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone, and I'd like to extend my welcome to you all as well, both you here in person and those of you tuning in online. And I'm delighted to be your chair of this first session, Sustainable Food Systems. In this session, we will look at sustainable food systems in a global context and examine some of the current challenges and opportunities. And then we'll gain some market insights on how sustainability is shaping consumer behaviour in Ireland, and what nutritional adequacy looks like in healthy and sustainable diets. And inside the farm gate, we'll also take a look at Ireland's livestock systems in terms of their carbon footprints and sustainability, and examine some of those metrics in an international context. Our speakers today are Badi Besbes from FAO, Deirdre Ryan from Board BIA, Laurence Shalloo in place of Jonathan Heron, and Sinéad McCarthy, both of whom are from Teagasc. A little bit of housekeeping, in fact, that we'll hear from the 4 speakers first, and then open the floor for a question and answer session. And that will lead us up to our break at coffee at 11:35. A gentle reminder that we are live streaming and recording the event today. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote presenter for our first keynote presentation this morning. And that's Badi Besbes from the Feed and Genetics branch of the FAO Animal Production and Health Division, and he'll deliver his talk on sustainable food systems in a global context, current opportunities and challenges. Badi has a long-standing experience in the management of animal genetic resources and in supporting intergovernmental policy processes. Badi, very welcome to the stage.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. And thanks to Teagasc for inviting me to share with you FAO's perspective on the sustainable transformation of the livestock sector within the global agri-food systems. So please allow me to start by giving you or recalling the global picture. Today, we are 8 billion people on this planet, and our population will grow by 2 billion people by 2050. As a result of that, the the demand for animal source food will increase, or is estimated that it will increase by 20% by 2050 in comparison with the 2020. And the demand for meat will increase the most. The increasing demand for animal source food, especially since the 90s, is mainly driven by the demand in Asia, and in particularly in Eastern Asia. However, it's expected that this growth in demand will slow down in the next decades. At the same time, you can see that it's expected that demand in Africa will increase in the future, mainly because most of African countries, the demand will double by 2050. And this is essentially due to the growth in populations in Africa. If I take sub-Saharan Africa, today sub-Saharan Africa has close to 2 billion people living in sub-Saharan Africa. And by 2050, sub-Saharan Africa will reach 2 billion people. This means in 25 years, the population will increase by 850 million in 25 years. In other words, the population will increase by 35 million per year. I think 5 times the population of Ireland, just to put this into the context. At the same time, the demand in Europe and Oceania is projected to stagnate and even decline. So these big figures about the demand and the supply is mainly driven by the population size. But what about the consumption, the human consumption? And what is our part? What part of our diet comes from animal source food? As you can see in this graph, plants provide most of our energy intake. Livestock provide 14% of the calorie we consume, with variation between regions. For protein, livestock provide 32% of our protein intake, but again with big variation. In Africa, in West Africa, livestock provide only 10% of the protein that we consume, but in North America, it's 60%, 6 times more. So what these figures tell us? It tells us that first, all diets are plant-based diets. So we have tendency to blame livestock, but our diet is basically a plant-based diet. The second conclusion we can draw out of this, the consumption varies widely between regions. Yet, the messages on animal source foods tend to be oversimplified, and the perspective of high-income countries tends to be generalized to low and mid-income countries. Clearly, there is no one-size-fits-all, and the perspective depends on the country context, depends on the needs and priority of each region and each country. Let's look at the opportunities brought about by the livestock sector. Clearly, the livestock sector has a lot to offer for better life and for better health of the people and the planet. The livestock sector provides ecosystem services, important ecosystem services, and I think the videos mentioned many of them. It improves resilience to change and improve adaptation to climate change, but not only to climate change, to market change and to other challenges. It contributes to employment. It contributes to poverty reduction and rural development, as well as gender equality, especially in low-income countries. but it also contributes to food security and nutrition. Animal source food are highly nutrient dense. They provide high quality protein, a number of essential fatty acids, and highly bioavailable and bioactive micronutrients, minerals, and vitamins. If we take the example of milk, we have released a report last year on the contribution of animal source food to healthy diet. And this report showed clearly that milk and milk products contributes to human nutrition and development throughout the life cycle, from pregnancy to childhood to adolescent and school-age children, but also adult and older adults. And at each of these stages, animal source food provide essential quality proteins, essential micronutrients, and important minerals and vitamins like vitamin A, B12, zinc, iron, and other minerals. Here in this figure, I wanted to show you a relationship between the consumption of protein and food insecurity presented by the Global Hunger Index. So each dot is one country. And you can see here that countries with the lowest supply of animal protein show the highest hunger index. This is not causative relationship, but it illustrates the importance of animal source food for a healthy diet and nutrition. I have a similar figure in relation to stunting of children before the age of 5. And here in this figure, you have the relationship between meat consumption and stunting. And again, here you have see even stronger trend in the sense that countries with the lowest consumption of meat show the highest rate of stunted in children. So, but livestock provides much more than nutritious food. Livestock play important role, important economic, social, and cultural role. Livestock provide diverse product and services. They provide hide, they provide fiber, they provide traction, energy, they provide manure that fertilizes the soil and improve crop production. But also livestock contribute to economic growth and employment generation. We estimate that the livestock sector worldwide contribute between 20 and 40% of the agriculture GDP. This is at the global level. The higher the value addition in the livestock sector, the higher the contribution of the livestock sector. But in some countries, especially in arid and semi-arid lands, livestock provide much more than that because it's difficult to produce crop in this environment. And I was explaining yesterday that countries like Somalia, the livestock sector represent 80%, 80, of the agriculture GDP, and many cases are like that. Livestock also contributes to women empowerment and gender equality, especially in developing countries. And in low and mid-income countries, the bulk of animal products are produced by small-scale producers. Here I gave the example of milk. The world's milk, or more than 30% of the world's milk is produced in South Asia, and in particularly in India. But the farm size in India is less than 2 cows per household. And this is really important to have into consideration. In rural areas in sub-Saharan Africa, women represent more than 70% of chicken owners. For small-scale producers, including women producers, livestock provide food, but provide cash, provide income for these people. And for most of these people, livestock is provide daily income. Egg, and especially egg and milk, is obtained on a daily basis, is consumed or sold on a daily basis, and providing income for this population. Livestock also is very important for the resilience of this household. Livestock can be sold in times of need, but also used as an asset or as a warranty to obtain credit from the bank or from the borrower. But along with these benefits comes a number of challenges, and I'm going to raise or present some of them. I start with the challenge related to animal health. You all know that about 70% of pathogens affecting a human have animal origin. And these zoonoses have major impact on the small-scale producers and on the rural poor. And zoonoses are responsible for 2.7 million deaths every year. Many non-zoonotic diseases trigger heavy economic loss. The loss of food and mouth disease in endemic area is estimated between 6.5 and 21 billion per year. Antimicrobials is used to treat animals, but in many regions, many countries, is used also to promote growth. A large part of this antimicrobial is released in the environment. And misuse and overuse of antimicrobial lead to antimicrobial resistance. And we estimate that 700,000 of human death occurs every year due to antimicrobial disease resistance or resistant infections. Animal welfare matters not only for ethical reasons, but also for economic reasons. We know that stressed animals produce less, and the product from stressed animals are less, the quality is quietly impacted. The second challenge I wish to share with you is related to land and land use change. We know that the livestock sector is the biggest user of land. We estimate that the livestock sector uses 40% of arable land. And the conversion of forest in certain regions into agricultural land is driven by demand for animal feed. We know also that the livestock sector consumes 30% of the cereal production. But as you can see here, most of this cereal production is used for monogastrics, for pig and poultry production. So the livestock sector as a whole, or the feed used for the livestock sector as a whole, 80% of that is not edible for human. And this percentage is even higher for ruminants. Only 5% of the cereal is consumed by ruminants, and the rest is not edible for human. The FAO estimates that the livestock sector accounts for 6.2 gigaton CO2 equivalent per year. This represents about 12% of the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. It represents 40% of the emissions from agri-food system. About more than 60% of these emissions are from cattle. And 2/3 of these emissions are produced to produce meat, and 30% for milk production. If we look at the sources and type of emissions, we see that more than half of the emissions is in the form of methane due to enteric fermentation, but also due to manure, and 15% for nitrous oxide produced by manure, but also by manufacturing fertilizer and pesticide. The rest is in the form of CO2 that is produced by fossil fuel to produce feed, but also for transport, processing of transport and processing of feed, transport of live animal, processing and transport of animal products, as well as land use change. I wish to also share with you interesting figures on the loss of genetic diversity in the livestock sector. In this figure, you have the distribution of Holstein cattle around the world. We have reports from 130 countries reporting the presence of Holstein in the country, and the colors, or the stronger the color is, illustrates the number of national breed population linked or related to Holstein. So Holstein are present in the countries in the form of as a pure breed Holstein, but also in most of the cases as crossbred. And unfortunately, in many countries, this crossbreeding is occurring in a very indiscriminate way, and many local populations do not longer exist because of the crossbreeding with the Holstein population. So we know that this report is, so 136 countries reported the presence of Holstein or several types of Holstein in the country. And what is striking is that if you look at current Holstein bulls can be traced, all the worldwide current bulls in Holstein can be traced to 2 males. This is I think the figure is, they talk by themselves. So this is also an issue. It's important to have that in mind. After this first introduction on the issues and challenges, I would like to share with you some slides on what FAO is doing towards the transformation on the livestock sector. And I would like to start by saying that FAO in the last 10 years, and since 2010, FAO is guided by a strategic framework that is developed for a period of 10 to 15 years and is reviewed every 4 years. The current strategic framework, 2022-31, was endorsed in June 21 at the FAO conference, the highest governing bodies of FAO. So all FAO's work on livestock is guided by the strategic framework and aligned with the strategic framework. The strategic framework gives a vision for FAO's work and is built around 4 aspirations or 4 betters. These are better production, better nutrition, better environment, and better health. So all of our work on livestock is geared towards these 4 betters. Just wanted to share with you what's FAO doing on the ground, in the field, in terms of livestock, support livestock development and livestock transformation. This is just a snapshot of the involvement of FAO on the ground, how FAO is supporting member countries. And just in 2023, FAO has implemented 374 projects in 121 countries for a total budget of more than 600 million. And this project benefited 25 million people. Of course, we are doing this with the partners, international and national partners. In terms of normative work, the important achievement is the establishment of the subcommittee on livestock under the Committee on Agriculture, one of the major technical committees in FAO. And the subcommittee mandate is to discuss and build consensus on livestock issues and priorities and advise FAO's policy and technical work on livestock. The work of the subcommittee is organized around 3 thematic areas: sustainable livestock system for food security, nutrition, and inclusive economic growth, animal, public, and environmental health through the One Health approach, and natural resource use, climate change, and biodiversity. These 3 major areas summarizes the contribution of animal source food or livestock production to the SDGs. The subcommittee has its first meeting in March 22, and its second meeting in last July in 24. And on the photos you have in the middle Mr. Donald Coleman, who is now acting as the chair of the subcommittee. So Ireland is a very active member in the work of FAO's work on livestock. FAO also developed a sustainable livestock transformation framework organized around 5 pillars. The first pillar is building science and evidence-based. So we are really fully aligned with your topic today. And under this pillar, FAO collects, analyze, and disseminate evidence to its member to build their own narrative on their sustainable livestock transformation. And the second pillar is promoting the adoption of tailored and context-specific good practices. And here, FAO works with partners to identify scalable good practices throughout the whole value chain. The third pillar is promoting and implementing policy and responsible investment for impact at scale. We work with member countries, directly with member countries. We work with international financial institutions like the World Bank, the International Fund for Agriculture Development, the African Development Bank, etc., to develop and implement policies and investment plans in member countries. The fourth pillar is about cooperation and partnership. Definitely, FAO does not work alone. We work with partners, a wide range of partners, public and private sectors. We work with the civil society organizations and with international how to say that, multilateral organizations. So in all our work, we are taking a holistic approach that considers the 3 dimensions or all dimensions of sustainability on equal footing. So this framework was endorsed at the subcommittee on livestock. It was also endorsed at the last meeting of the Committee on Agriculture in October. And at the same time, the Committee on Agriculture recommended FAO to develop, in consultation with members and in a participatory manner, a negotiated global plan of action for sustainable livestock transformation in order to operationalize this framework. So this global plan of action is relevant for all stakeholders. It's relevant for members, for the private sector, for research and academia, and civil society. Everybody should be involved in this development of the global plan of action. It covers all livestock production systems, small scale, but also large scale systems. It's a voluntary global instrument. It will be negotiated by member countries. And once adopted, every country is encouraged to translate this global plan of action into national action plan that is tailored to the context of the country, to the need of the country, and the priorities of the country. So where we are in the development of this global plan of action, We are now conducting a series of consultation, regional consultation, but also consultation with all partners. The consultation is on the GPA outlines, but also on the priority areas. We hope to have this document ready by end of next year. It will be submitted to member countries. It will be negotiated. And then the draft from the first round of negotiation, we hope to have an extraordinary session of the subcommittee end of next year. And the outcome of this negotiation will go into second iteration of negotiation that will take place in mid of next year. And we hope that this GPA will be endorsed by July, August next year in Rome. So with this, thank you for your attention. I was alerted that I have to stop here. And I hope we see you next year at the second Global Conference on Sustainable Livestock Transformation in Rome. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Badi, for that really insightful presentation, and we look forward to discussing that in more detail at the question and answer session that will follow. But I'm delighted to invite our second speaker to the podium, is Deirdre Ryan from Bord Bia, to deliver her talk on the evolving sustainability landscape, a market perspective. And Deirdre is Director of Sustainability and Quality Assurance, Origin Green at Bord Bia, where she's responsible for the strategic development and management of national quality assurance and sustainability programmes for the Irish food and drink sector. Deirdre, you're very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Siobhán, and thank you for the invitation to Teagasc. So yeah, today I'm going to provide a bit of a market perspective on sustainability and how that's influencing the key theme for today around science and agriculture and the supply chain. But just to kick off, just to share a bit of the shape of the Irish market for food and drink, we export 16.3 billion worth of produce every year. So that's 24% increase on pre-pandemic levels back in 2019. And this is both an increase in value and volume on that period, and amounts to 45 million worth of produce every single day to 180 countries around the world. So this is very much built on our sustainability and quality credentials. So when we export to 180 countries, it really matters what the world thinks of us and the credibility of what we say about our produce. Just to give you a bit of an idea of where that food and drink goes, so about 1/3 goes to international markets. And when we refer to international markets, we're talking about everything outside of Europe and the UK. We have about 34% going to the UK and 5.8 billion to the EU. So roughly breaks down as about 1/3. So I will share maybe some of the trends and sustainability around the consumers in those markets at a later stage. But I'm going to give a bit of an overview on the emerging legislation around sustainability and how that's influencing the need for science and evidence and the work that's done in Teagasc. So there's a number of different emerging pieces of legislation. Some of them you'll be very familiar with around EU nature restoration, nitrates directive, animal welfare regulations, and so on. And the associated topics with those being climate change, biodiversity, a lot of the topics we've already seen and discussed a little bit today, and I know there's a lot more to come on that. There's some emerging topics around human rights due diligence as well, and I know social sustainability will come up at a later stage. But what I'm going to hone in on is some of the key regulations that are affecting our global customers. We have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the EU Deforestation Regulation and Green Claims Regulation that are absolutely front of mind for trade customers of Irish agriculture, and also impacting a lot of our big companies here. And with that comes a huge appetite from our customer base for the evidence and data points around sustainability. So the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is essentially a really wide-ranging directive that's going to bring sustainability reporting for the first time in line with financial reporting. So it's been implemented on a phased approach. It commenced in 2024. A lot of Irish companies are in line for reporting in 2026 with 2025 data. They will have to report on sustainability matters that affect the company, but also sustainability matters across the entire supply chain. So there'll be a huge need for data points on farm level, as well as operational sustainability topics within the scope of a company's operations. When we speak about materiality, what are material topics that will have to be reported on? Companies in scope for reporting will have to report on how that company is impacting the environment, impacting social sustainability as well, but also how these matters will impact business performance. So there's about 50,000 companies going to be in scope in Europe. There's about most of our big exporters, all the dairy cooperatives, and all our big meat companies. Huge number of companies here in Ireland are going to have to report on this as well. Some of the topics that fall under the Sustainability Reporting Directive are, as I said, materiality process, so understanding where and what you're impacting on the environment and social sustainability, the risks in your supply chain, as well as topics, what kind of targets you have, what your climate transition plan is, what your biodiversity transition plan is, how you're going to measure, monitor it, what your governance around it is, as well as things like risk from a business perspective. So sustainability is very much coming into the financial sphere as well. Banks, regulators are looking at all of these topics that we'll be discussing today. It covers topics of environmental protection, so what your policies are in relation to the environment, social responsibility, your treatment of your employees, how you're approaching the just transition, respecting human rights, even down to areas of reporting on corporate governance and your diversity on your boards. So hugely impactful piece of legislation that's really going to come to the fore in 2020, in 2025 and 2026. Small companies, listed companies are also going to have to report on all of these topics. I guess the relevance of this is a lot of the work that's being done, a lot of the carbon footprinting and so on. All of this data is very much now going to be required from a financial perspective, but also from a legislative company corporate reporting perspective. Companies in scope, just briefly, are companies that have over 250 employees, or entities or organisations that have over 250 employees and have assets of 25 million. So a lot of companies coming into scope, all of our key customers. So this gives you a bit of an idea of the standards within the CSRD. There are 13 standards that need to be reported on around climate change, mitigation, adaptation, pollution, social and social sustainability. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to highlight that this is a really broad-ranging piece of legislation. And there's probably about 800 to 1,000 data points that will need to be reported on from a company perspective. So huge burden, but also really highlights the importance of having evidence and data and research to back up what we are doing here. And it's very much driving the agenda in the marketplace. above and beyond what we talk about when consumers are looking at sustainability. The corporate agenda is even more, I would say, a bigger burden on companies really than what consumers understand for sustainability. So very challenging in terms of the regulatory pressures. Another important piece of legislation that will influence how we market Irish food and drink around the world is the Green Claims legislation. There's two pieces of legislation, the Green Claims one and empowering consumers on the green transition, and they're both part of the Green Deal. They're complementary pieces of legislation, and really what they're aiming to do is promote sustainable consumer choices, target misleading environmental claims, and really empower consumers to be able to have accurate information to make more informed choices. So this will present opportunities and challenges for us. It'll even the playing field in terms of, other companies claiming climate neutrality, which we see all the time from some other countries. We stand over the science. We have evidence-based communications based on the work done here in Teagasc, and that's going to even be more important in the years to come. So essentially what the Green Claims Directive says is that all claims around the environment by law will now have to be based on science, and they will have to take a life cycle perspective. Also, what's also important is that you can't talk about the carbon footprint of a product without exploring the impacts on biodiversity as well. So you have to if you're speaking about an environmental aspect of a product, you have to consider all environmental aspects of a product. So if someone's talking about carbon intensity but biodiversity and they're not addressing sustainability in a holistic way, you'll no longer be able to speak about those sustainability credentials. You also can't talk about what is kind of currently normal practice. So if something's in the legislation anyway, it's very normal practice globally, you'll no longer be able to, speak about it as a virtue of your sustainability credentials. And again, GHG offsets have to be reported in a very transparent manner. We do see globally, particularly countries like New Zealand claiming climate neutrality on products a lot more regularly, and things like that. So that will even the playing field around some of that, and those particularly operating in Europe. The Empowering Consumers Directive is a little bit more focused on reliable information, things like durability, repairability, false claims, but also goes into social information as well. And then one of the final pieces of legislation that is emerging and will come into force in 2025, it's now been delayed by 12 months, it was supposed to come into force in December, is the EU deforestation regulation. So this piece of legislation has been brought in to promote sustainable supply chains, and again aligns with the Green Deal, and very much again it's a huge burden on companies and will affect the supply chain as well. But I guess the overarching objective of it was to promote sustainability, get rid of deforestation, particularly around feed and everything else coming in from other countries. So what it requires is a mandatory due diligence statement, traceability down to the plot of land, so geotagging of land plots, and proof of compliance with local laws and deforestation. So the in-scope topics, the in-scope products are the ones you see there: palm oil, soy, wood, cocoa, coffee, cattle, and rubber. So there's a lot to be teased out in this piece of legislation, but again, things like traceability and supply chain sustainability being brought to the forefront. So the reason I mention those is because I guess this is going to really affect the research, the data that we'll need in the supply chain. It's also affecting a lot of our trade customers and the demand for data across the supply chain. And I'll go into some of our trade customer commitments in a few moments. But when we look at sustainability from a consumer perspective, the end consumer, they're often quite removed from some of these legislative topics, but we do see a lot of global trends around sustainability, and we did a big piece of research in Borbia a number of years ago, and while this research is 3 years old, we have a tracker on all of these sustainability topics so we can monitor how they've been trending since then. So it was a very broad-ranging study we did on 11,000 global consumers in the 13 markets that we have offices in. We also spoke to key sustainability experts around the world around the topics that are trending, the topics that are emerging, and where we should be focusing our attention as well. We spoke to 190 nearly buyers of Irish food and drink, so a lot of the big blue chip trade customers that we have, to understand what they are thinking about when we speak about sustainability. So we divided sustainability into the 3 pillars to understand what's important. And one of the key findings is very much that consumers are nearly behind the trend in terms of sustainability as compared to a trade customer, a buyer of Irish food and drink, as compared to the media, as compared to many of the people in the room working in a different sphere. What consumers understand about sustainability is much simpler. It's much more tangible. It's much more around the things that they see in front of them. It's about sustainable packaging, food waste. How can I affect change, and how can I engage in that change, rather than topics that might, like regenerative agriculture or, GHG emissions, ammonia. They just don't understand those topics in a consumer setting. But what we do find is things are moving in what we call an adoption hierarchy. So consumers in markets that are more au fait with sustainability are moving up that hierarchy of adoption around topics and understanding more around things like carbon footprint and so on. So some markets are more mature. It's the buyers that are driving the agenda, and the sustainability leads even more so. So from an agenda setter perspective, we see GHG emissions, biodiversity, water quality are all topics that are front of mind, whereas a consumer might not understand them. We see topics of circular bioeconomy coming to the fore, around sustainable livelihoods as well. But from a consumer perspective, we see that they are interested in sustainability. They will be more interested in the future. They're willing to make changes, but they're still conscious that it's too expensive. So that's still a factor. They're still seeking value. We also see there's market nuances. So in the likes of Western Europe, high animal welfare and local produce is important, whereas in Eastern markets, it's probably more around nutrition, safety, quality, community. But in our recent, I would say in the last year to 12 months, we're seeing the big corporate customers, even in the Eastern markets, the big hotel chains have corporate agendas, irrespective of their company they're operating in. So recent trade missions to Asia have shown that hierarchy is very apparent, and the likes of carbon and other topics are very much part of the conversation. US has kind of a broader range of associations with topics. So in Germany, stuff like, sustainable packaging, low miles, animal welfare standards, consumers understand things like palm oil and carbon footprint. But when we move to a market like China, while I did, as I said, say that they're getting more interested in biodiversity and other topics, it is still quality assurance, high safety standards, things like animal welfare and low food miles further down the agenda. And the US, again, broad range of topics, food waste, those more tangible elements around pasture reared and so on. So a lot of the data points that we're collating are really, really relevant in those markets. We're also mapping this on an annual basis, and we see nature, particularly in regen ag, becoming more to the forefront of minds of our consumers. So, and regen ag, again, it's around water quality, biodiversity, soil health, becoming more and more important. So, I know we're speaking about biodiversity later today, but again, very much a consumer topic, and yeah, waste and ethics and things still to the forefront. So we keep that tracked every year. And as I said, what nature coming to the fore in terms of deforestation, water usage, and more, and topics like nutrition also very much front of mind. So our trade customers. These are an example of our 13 markets and the kind of key customers within those markets. You can't really see the map, or I can from my angle anyway. But these are the customers that are setting the agenda from a procurement requirements perspective. So these companies are setting really ambitious targets around Scope 3 emissions, so with emissions in the supply chain. AMR was mentioned earlier. We're even seeing, like, a consumer won't understand AMR, but our global customers are eliminating the use of high priority antibiotics. So it's front of mind from a customer perspective. And these customers are asking their suppliers to support them in meeting their sustainability targets. They're setting science-based targets, requiring their suppliers to do the same. In some of these markets, I know I'm nearly running out of time, so I won't go into any great detail, but within some of our high priority markets, like Germany, there are also sustainability standards that all the retailers in those countries are adopting. And animal welfare space requirement and antibiotic monitoring is very much to the forefront of those. And the Haltungsform is the one where we would be under pressure in Germany. And the same in Netherlands, standards like the Better Leven, and benchmarking our own standards to them is really important in terms of ensuring we can keep those really, really high value markets. So just to kind of think about some of the implications of all of this, it is an increasingly challenging regulatory landscape for sustainability. This is very much driven by the EU, but not solely. There's similar standards in the US for countries or companies operating within the EU. They will have to meet the same standards. We know consumers are demanding more sustainable products. Whether they're going to pay for them is the big question. But we still need to differentiate, tailor the message to each of those markets. And while they're still driven by value, it's absolutely becoming a requirement from a consumer perspective as well. Our trade customers are very much setting ambitious sustainability targets, struggling to get there. There's an opportunity in that for Ireland to be able to support and meet those supply chain targets. And we've seen sustainability also move into the procurement function. So it's not a sustainability team in the corner anymore, very much part of the commercial conversations. So for us and for today, while there is an increased regulatory burden across the supply chain, the importance of the research and evidence for substantiating those claims is essential. The Teagasc carbon models work on carbon sequestration, and there is a heightened role for verification and accreditation through green claims directives, the need for standards and verification. I'd also like to highlight the importance of, within this very complex environment for sustainability, it's really important that we put the importance of the Irish system solutions first in evidence. So the importance of collaborations like AgNav with ICBF, Teagasc and ourselves, to share what we're doing and put evidence behind it, but very much in an Irish context, or it will be put onto us in terms of footprinting and so on. We need a broader range of sustainability topics, which is part of the AgNav plans as well, around biodiversity. Social sustainability is going to come to the fore as well, water quality. All of these areas will need more detailed evidence and data points. And of course, clarity and transparency across the supply chain being essential. So Very challenging environment, but I think for a country like Ireland, for the collaborations that work here in Ireland, and for our systems, our grass-based systems, as mentioned earlier, there is a huge advantage to be able to show that demonstrable progress to the world. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Deirdre. A real tour de force there in terms of the, I suppose, landscape that we are dealing with here from our Irish perspective. And to follow on that, I'd really like to invite our third speaker, Dr. Laurence, Professor Laurence Shalloo from Teagasc, to give his presentation on the sustainability of Ireland's livestock systems. And Laurence is head of the Animal and Grassland Research and Innovation Programme at Teagasc, and he's an extensive track record on research and global networks in animal-based farming systems. Laurence, you're very welcome.
So, Jonathan Hearn, who is co-author in this paper, should be up here, but they decided they wanted diversity in the speakers, right? So they're just tall. They told me I was next, so that means that I must be small. And then there's a whole lot of other things that Deirdre is that I'm not, so that's why I'm here instead of Jonathan. So, how sustainable are livestock systems? And this is in comparison to a number of different countries we're around the world. So we're going to have a quick chat. Frank talked about this, so I'm not going to dwell on it. Today, all of these topics are going to be discussed. I'm only going to deal with environmental, but the whole range of these topics are going to be discussed as we go throughout the day. So, if we look at environmental sustainability, I'm going to take three aspects. And as Deirdre said, it's not just about, picking one metric and focusing on that will probably lead you to the wrong conclusion. So I'm going to focus on three metrics here, but the other metrics are also being dealt with as we go throughout today. So I'm dealing with greenhouse gases, water use, and feed-food competition. And Badi touched a little bit on the feed-food competition. I'm going to give it to you from an Irish context. A little bit of background, and Frank talked about this when he was introducing the topic. I suppose we are unique, and we talk about a grass-based system, and it's kind of just thrown out there, but I don't think people fully realise the difference between Irish systems and our EU, in an EU context. So, on average, over 80% of the diet is from pasture on a dry matter basis. We are, the other kind of thing out there is that because we have a derogation, that we're high in terms of stocking rate. We're in the bottom third from a nitrogen surplus point of view when we look at agriculture in Ireland relative to overall Europe point of view. The key drivers of profit is not milk yield. In a TMR system or a high input system, one of the key drivers of profitability and efficiency is driving milk yield per cow or live weight gain. It's about maximising grass utilisation and maximising the proportion of forage in the diet. The other point here is that manure is largely returned directly by the animal. So, again, in EU context where animals are housed for most of the year, it's very easy to separate the manure from the animal. In a grazing system, unfortunately, the animal is doing most of the work in putting the manure back onto the paddock. So separating those two is quite difficult. And again, we don't fully, I suppose, maybe get that across. The other thing is soils have a large store of carbon, and that's because we've been grass-based for a long time. We have policy requirements to reduce emissions by 25%, and we need to be clear that we have to be on a journey to meet these emission reductions targets. So when I talk about emission, carbon footprints, etc., the context here is we have to reduce emissions relative to the policy requirements. And I suppose in our systems, maximising efficiency or productivity is driven by maximising grass utilisation. My colleague Donald O'Brien developed a model to quantify the amount of grass in a diet of a dairy cow back in 2017, I think this is. Unfortunately, my site is gone. But so basically what this model does is calculates the proportion of grass in the diet or overall pasture in the diet. So in this analysis between 2013 and 23, we're at approximately 81% of the diet is in the form of pasture for our dairy cows. About 17% is concentrate, and about 1.4% is alternative forage. So that's what the diet of a typical dairy cow looks like on an Irish farm, and that's on a dry matter basis. When we do that on a fresh matter basis, that figure for pasture is closer to 95%. When we then look at it and go back to Badi's presentation, we talk about the amount of, that concentrate that we feed that is actually from grains that could be human edible, that's not byproduct, that figure drops to 6%. So of our dairy cows, 6% of the diet is of a grain that could potentially go into the human diet. So that's what our diet looks like at the moment. When we look at the efficiency of our system, we use two metrics. The first metric is the edible protein conversion ratio. So what's this? It's the amount of human edible protein produced relative to the human edible protein consumed by the cow. So that's the first metric that we have. Human edible in versus human edible out. A little bit more complex is where we take into account the opportunity cost of the land that could be used to produce human edible. So that is the land use ratio. So it's human edible protein potential of an animal diet relative to the human edible proteins produced by the animal. So basically what we're looking at here is what could be, what human edible food could be produced with that land if it wasn't used for animal agriculture versus what is produced. So we're going to talk about these two metrics. So first thing is we're going to compare, the first one is the simple conversion ratio. We're going to compare total mixed ration. So that's how TMR, how most of the milk in the world is produced, relative to grass-based systems. So that's our first comparison. And this grass-based system is actually a French grass-based system I'm showing you here to start with. So this is a French grass-based system. It's based on a 2018 paper that was published. So the first thing to say is when we just look at simple conversion ratios, your TMR system is giving you 1 kilo of human edible in, gives you 1 kilo of human edible out. So you stand back and you think about maybe some of the negatives that Badi talked about in terms of animal agriculture from a greenhouse gas point of view, from an ammonia point of view, from an AMR point of view. That's not a great ratio, and that's not a very positive thing to be talking about. Whereas in this French grass-based system, for every kilo of human edible that was going in, there was 2.6 kilos coming out. We move on then, and we talk about the Irish grass-based system. So a PhD student working with Jonathan and myself over the last number of years has published a number of papers, but this one just showed the comparison between an Irish grass-based system, and we're at, on average, 5.5 to 1. So essentially, for every kilo of human edible going into the diet of a dairy cow, we're producing 5.5 kilos out. That's the simple calculation. If we look at the land use ratio, when we take the potential of that land to produce a human edible protein, that figure comes out at roughly 0.5. So for your EPCR, your conversion ratio, the higher the number, the better. For the land use ratio, the lower the number, the better. So you can see here that it's under 1, and your suckler system comes out at 1.25. Interestingly, when we take the quality of the land into account, the poorer the quality of the land, the better the number. So when we take land suitable for arable, so if we say that 0% of the land is suitable for arable, our numbers between dairy and suckler they're quite similar at roughly 0.25 versus 0.28. But as the land suitability for arable increases, essentially our land use ratios go the wrong way. We want these figures to be under 1. If we're under 1, we're producing more human edible than the potential of that land. So very quickly for the suckler system, it goes up. So, sucklers on land suitable for arable becomes inefficient very quickly from these numbers. And if you look at it here from a dairy point of view and its beef, you can see here that also, as land becomes suitable for arable, the efficiency of that system also starts to deteriorate. And that's based on work that we had done with a PhD student. The second metric I want to talk about is greenhouse gases, right? And the first question here, is there anyone here from New Zealand? Good, because this won't be pretty. So this is a paper that was done about 2 years ago and published in the Journal of Dairy Science. It's a paper that basically took a whole range of different studies and it used them. It tried to calculate an equal number across the studies to do a comparison. But essentially, there are a number of problems with this study, but it's a comparison. The one reason I think it really is a nice study from one position is that it presents the data very clearly. So visually, we can see very clearly from here who's good, who's bad from a carbon footprint point of view. So in this study, it put Ireland at 105 kilos of CO2 per kilo of fat and protein corrected milk. Just in terms of some of the issues we have with this study. So take Ireland. The Irish data in this study was between 2010 and 2012. The New Zealand data was roughly 2018, I think. US study data is from 2019. Just then in terms of representation, so how representative is the data of each of the countries? Well, first thing is that there's 120 farms from the US. The Irish data is from the National Farm Survey. It's a representative sample. France had 95 farms included. China had 189 farms. Take Italy. Italy had 75 farms, but when you read the paper, 25 of those were from Austria. So there is just a number of issues from this study, but what's nice about this study is it's a nice way of presenting the data. So we're going on a journey here now. We're going to talk about different comparison methods. The first one is this New Zealand one, had us at 105. Incidentally, when we take the most recent published research from ourselves and what's available in the national inventory, along with new methane emission factors, our figure drops from 105 down to 0.88 from a dairy perspective. So that's the most recent published number in a comparison framework that's the same as the other countries. Not a good approach because you're taking different studies and that's problematic. The second approach that I'm going to talk about is the JRC report. We love this report, right? It's a really nice, same methodology used across countries, really robust methodologies used. You can add those criticisms, you can make it is too. Some of the data is not country specific, etc. But it's a really robust way of putting the numbers. And yeah, okay, we had the lowest footprint in this one, so we probably would like it from a cow milk point of view. But there's a problem with this study. The data, this was published in 2010, and the data is from 2004. So we really can't talk about this study anymore. It's not relevant to talk about this study because it's 20 years old when we do a comparison. So that's the cow milk one. So just in terms of the cow milk one, it had us at roughly 1, lowest in that comparison. And we talk about the beef footprint, it had us, I think, 3rd or 4th. But again, in a very competitive place in terms of that study. But because it's dated, because it's 20 years old, we can't really talk about these numbers anymore. The third study I want to talk about is a study published this year. It's published from one of my colleagues in Teagasc, and what it does was it took 71 commercial farms along the western side of Europe. It broke them into grazing, where they were grazing for greater than 220 days, mixed, where it was grazing for up to 219 days, and in houses where they weren't grazed at all. And I suppose it's a nice study because it just compares the different, it's up to date, it's about 4 to 5 years old. And basically what it shows here is that from a footprint point of view, the grazing systems come out pretty good. They're very similar to the mixed grazing system in terms of the overall analysis and comparison when we take GWP 100. So, point here is this is another study published this year, shows a good comparison of the overall numbers, and the grazing systems had the lowest carbon footprint and the lowest footprint per hectare. Second last study we'll just talk about in terms of footprint. This is a study my colleague Donald O'Brien did a number of years ago where we compared grass-based systems to confinement systems, and essentially the grass-based systems come out with a lower footprint than the confinement systems. And another paper that was published in the last number of years which compared high-performing farms in Ireland versus high-performing farms in the UK versus high-performing farms in the US, all showed a similar trend to what we've seen in the other studies, grass-based systems coming out better than confinement systems, even with really high-performing UK and US systems. The final one I just want to talk about is GLEAM, and GLEAM is from the FAO, really robust modelling framework. It basically is, I suppose, the overall focus of it is to be able to compare footprints for countries that are maybe more in the development phase. GLEAM themselves say that we should go and use our own models when we get to, when we are at a more advanced stage. So the aim is to quantify, the production and use of natural resources in the livestock sector and to identify the environmental impacts of livestock in order to contribute to the assessment and adaptation of mitigation scenarios. So a really good framework. So the first one I want to talk about here, and this was published this year. Now the data is 2015, 2016. So the data is not as new as we'd like it to be, but this came out this year from the GLEAM model. It compares regions, so it might be difficult to see from the back, but Ireland is here at 102 in terms of a carbon footprint. When we move across, you can see Australia and New Zealand is at 1.14, EU 27 is at 1.41, and so on. So from a carbon footprint point of view, this study out from GLEAM puts us at 102 It was published on the website this year. Obviously, the data is a little bit dated. And in terms of the beef side, it again puts us in a fairly good framework. Ireland, very similar to a number of other countries, but one of the lowest in terms of the overall framework. So what I'm trying to do by pointing all those pictures here is to kind of give you a framework of there is different approaches. By and large, when we correct for the differences and maybe issues in some of the approaches, largely they're putting grass-based Irish systems in a really competitive place from a carbon footprint point of view. Can we say we're the lowest in the world? Probably not, but we can say that we're in a really competitive place in terms of both dairy and beef production systems. The third section I just wanted to, and I'm not going to deal with that for long, is just in terms of water use. When we talk about water use, there's three, I suppose, different components. And I'm only going to deal with blue water use. And Donald has shown me the sign here, so we have to be, I'm watching time as well. So we're just going to focus on blue water use. And that's the water that's used in the production of the system. And just, this is all I'm going to put up in terms of the comparison and say that we published a paper in 2017 that put Irish blue water footprint of roughly about 7.7 kilos or litres of blue water per litre of fat and protein corrected milk. A Dutch study with similar co-authors, and we worked with IMCA on our numbers, put the Dutch system at 66 litres of blue water, and that's mainly because of irrigation. Obviously, we don't use irrigation here, and most of the grain that we use in our systems doesn't have irrigation either. So that had the Dutch system at 66 litres. A paper published this year from Al Rotz, and he did a really good paper in the US where he compared all the different regions. That had the US at about 110 litres of water per litre of fat and protein corrected milk. So that's the comparison we have. So we're really low. Sometimes, and lots of times, we give out about our climate, but I suppose it does mean that we don't have irrigation, and that has a big impact on the blue water footprint. The other point here is the stress, water stress index. How does this relate to where we are from a stress point of view? And you can see, when we look at the data and you look at maybe projections, that is something that we need to watch as we go forward. So just, I suppose, kind of in summary, coming to the end of where I'm going to talk about, we started off with this graph where I criticised it, but it's a nice way of showing the data, so I'm showing it up again. We started off with a carbon footprint of 105. We said that we were moving to 0.88 based on the most recent figures that we have. And finally, our best farmers, where the technology edge is out there in terms of our best farmers, are currently at 0.63 in terms of the fat and protein corrected, kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilo of fat and protein corrected milk. What do we need to achieve that? High technical performance, utilising 12 tonne of dry matter, 150 kilos of chemical nitrogen, 100% protected urea, all of the technologies that you're probably going to hear about as you go through today in terms of the MAC and what we need to achieve our reduction targets. So there is huge scope, and our best farmers are on that journey. The last two that I've added in here is slurry methane additives and enteric methane feed additives during the dry cow period. If we did this presentation probably a year and a half ago, they wouldn't have been on the list. So technology is coming, and technology is delivering some of these additional benefits that we need. Now, the question is, who's going to pay for these additional benefits as they come through? So that, the dairy system, that's the vision, that's where we want to get to, that's where the best farmers are heading today. The second point, just before we finish up, is that when we talk about food groups, we need to look across the overall diet. And this is kind of delving slightly into Sinéad's area, but it really talks about how we look at different foods. This is a Norwegian study that was published in 2016. It's a really nice study because it just shows how we need to look at foods at different, and it goes back to what Badi was talking about as well. So what it has is different food groups: milk, soft drinks, orange juice, beer, whatever. And it has the emissions per 100 grams. But it also has the nutrient density, or the nutrients we're getting from those different food groups, and it's relating one to the other. So unfortunately, if you look at beer, there is some greenhouse gases and there's no nutrient value, so that's a zero. So what we're looking for is higher numbers. Red wine doesn't perform very good either. But if you look at milk, it comes out with a figure of 0.54, so that's the nutrients relative to the emissions. It comes out with a 0.54, whereas some of the other products, some of the alternatives, don't perform that good in that sense because the nutrients are less. While they definitely have less emissions and emissions per unit of product, relative to the nutrient and the nutrient requirements, they are also less. And I suppose that kind of also needs to think about how we compare different food groups. So the DS score, digestible, indispensable amino acid score, which is a piece of work that was, again came out of the UN, just really compares the value of the nutrients relative to the different food groups. And when we look at some of the food groups, and we're not going to go into the detail here, but there is a difference. So one thing is comparing things on a gross protein point of view, but the other is to look at the nutrient value relative to the amino acids that you need. And that's something that also needs to be part of the equation when you look at different food groups. The second last slide is just talking about, you look at the Eat Lancet report, there's a lot in this report that's really good. And there's a lot of stuff here in the main conclusions that we can't actually argue with. I suppose one point that you'd have to say, and I think that I would say, is that one of the things that probably didn't jump out enough from the report is that, focusing and securing food groups from areas that are efficient to do so is also going to be a big contributor to reduced emissions. So where it's sustainable to produce a different food, whether that's beef or dairy or whatever it is, we should also be looking at that in terms of the overall numbers, because there's massive differences. There is massive differences in terms of global perspective, even within comparing countries in terms of the carbon footprint, and that should be part of our overall journey. So just to conclude, it's a very broad topic in terms of looking how sustainable our livestock systems are. We just looked at 3 metrics here. You could spend another hour here looking at different metrics. Overall assessment should include the 3 pillars of social, economic and environmental, and they're key when we look at, if we're not socially, if there's animal welfare issues, if there's labour issues, the system is not going to be social. If you're not making profit, it's not going to be sustainable. Or environmentally, if we're doing significant damage, that's also not going to be sustainable. I suppose within the 3 metrics we looked at, Irish pasture-based systems perform well. There are requirements to, further improvements are possible, and requirements to reduce emissions. And I suppose the final point here is that we need the sustainability debate to be at a global level rather than just at a national level. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Laurence, for taking us on that journey of data and evidence and many, many different approaches, and look forward to exploring that more in the question and answers. I'd now like to invite our 4th and final speaker for this session to the podium. It's Sinéad McCarthy, who will give her insights on nutritional adequacy in a healthy and sustainable diet. And Sinéad leads a research group here in Teagasc, who's responsible for leading on insights on consumer food behaviours and also on the areas of nutrition research with a focus on food and health. Sinéad.
Thanks very much, Siobhán, and thanks to Karen and colleagues for inviting me here today. There you'll see it is me, but that's a picture of me on a good day. I'm moving from the farm where we've just been and pasture grazing into our plates and our diets. And I'm conscious I'm standing between you and your coffee break and waking up a lot of you. But just to remind you, there's a very high carbon footprint associated with the coffee that you will be having. And that gets forgotten about in this debate. So every single thing we consume has a carbon footprint, some higher than others. But like the last presentation, it's important to look at the nutrient quality of how we consume it as well. So that brings me into the context of a sustainable diet and the role of a sustainable livestock system as well, because the more sustainable a production system we can have, the lower carbon intensity and emissions, therefore, we will be consuming in our diets. So looking first of all at the FAO definition of sustainable diets that was put out over 10 years ago. And in summary, they talk about being protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems, that they are culturally acceptable, so they're suitable to the country or the culture in which it's being consumed. Nutritionally adequate, so a sustainable diet isn't just about a low carbon footprint. It has to give us the amount of nutrients that we require for a healthy life as well and to keep us healthy. They also talk about being economically fair, and we saw that very much from the global perspective in Badi's presentation earlier, where there are gender and economic issues depending on the country that we look at and the livestock system that we look at. But coming back kind of more so to home, it all starts with the food production. So if food can be produced more sustainably, It'll get to our retailer more sustainably, and we saw from Deirdre's talk that the retailers are now looking at reducing their carbon footprint. They're looking for lower carbon footprint products coming into the stores from the producers. And then it ends up with us eating our lunch or dinner or any of our food. It has to be safe to eat, healthy. It has to meet our nutritional needs, and that's all part of the sustainable food consumption. So everybody plays a role in that, and it's not just us at the nutrition end of the spectrum. So if we have this more sustainable production, we have lower carbon intensity of the foods, both that we consume here and that we export, and we've seen how much of our product goes abroad from Deirdre's presentation. And that helps us as consumers choose lower emission foods to consume, and therefore contribute to this sustainable diet piece. If we start with dietary guidelines, and as a nutritionist and somebody who's worked in the area of public health nutrition for the last 30 years, about 30 years probably, the food pyramid came out in 1990. And whether it's the food pyramid or the Eat Well plate we see in the UK and various different options around the world, they're designed to achieve optimal nutrition intake. So if I was to tell you have to consume 80 milligrams of vitamin C a day for health, you have to think, well, what foods contain vitamin C? How much of them do I need to eat? And so on. And you have to think of every single nutrient to try and get a balanced diet. Whereas if we just follow a picture like this, eat as much as you can from the bottom and reduce as you go up to the top and eat as little as possible from the top. So that was launched back in 1990 by the Department of Health in Ireland. Acid rain and the ozone layer were the environmental concerns we were worried about. The carbon footprint of food hadn't been considered at all. It's not a feature that takes place even in nutrition education much. So as nutritionists, we don't tend to worry about manure management or pasture base. And we need to start thinking and incorporating more of this production side and agriculture into our sustainable diets and nutrition discourse. So we now need to bring in this additional layer of planetary health onto this food pyramid. And how do we do that? Well, many will suggest removal of an essential food group. And if you think this has been risk assessed and designed such that we get the right adequate amount of nutrients, but a lot of people are looking at or suggesting that we remove this protein shelf, or that we remove the plant-based protein that's on that shelf at least, and by virtue of it having a high carbon footprint, we now have a low carbon footprint diet. So on paper, it makes sense. But when we actually go to look at it further, it's more than just that. And there's I suppose if you think of our bodies and our diets as an ecosystem similar to the environmental ecosystem, if we remove an entire essential food group from our diet, what are the consequences for that? There's significant evidence out there of micronutrient deficiencies when we remove meat, especially red meat. It's an excellent source of protein, iron, zinc, D and B vitamins. And we saw about the digestibility of the protein in the last presentation and so on. And that's one of the real key elements of red meat. It's the amino acid profile we get from this versus a plant-based alternative. And milk is also an excellent source of B12 and many bioactive compounds. So there's actually nutrients in milk that we don't even really know about, or how they interact with other nutrients in our diet as well can have a very positive effect. And for the most part, these nutrients are more frequently, the bioavailability is better from the animal rather than the plant sources. And what I mean by that is if you consume a tin of beans or a fillet steak, you're going to get the iron absorbed much better from the fillet steak, that heme iron, than what you will from the iron that you're getting in beans. Vitamin B12 can only be found in animal source foods. So removing vitamin B12 from in terms of meat, removing meat means we are more than likely to get deficient in B12. So it requires, it's back to that piece about the vitamin C and the orange. Now you have to think, well, now I've taken this out. And even as somebody who's a nutritionist, and I used to be able to quote data from the McCann-Widdowson composition of foods, I would still be really stuck to think, okay, now what foods do have it? Do I need to take a supplement? It requires a lot of careful management and careful planning to get it back into your diet in alternative ways. So these nutrients, these foods that have a high carbon footprint, if you like, are frequently suggested to be removed from the diet because that'll give us a lower overall footprint. But we're removing a lot of essential nutrients when we do that. If we take a quick look at, say, comparing the Eat Lancet, which is quite a strict set of guidelines and while yes, much of it is good and we should be eating more plants in our diet, they have really, really restricted the meat intake, as well as potatoes. Your 2 small baby potatoes, that's your weekly intake of potatoes from the Eat Lancet. That's certainly a guideline I would have great difficulty in following. But if we look at, they recommend 14 grams of red meat per day in the Eat Lancet diet, which will give you about 0.42 micrograms, less than half a microgram of B12. As adults, we require 1.5 micrograms of B12 in our daily diet. If we look at the food pyramid, now my recommendation here is a little bit contentious, and I have calculated based on the kind of minimum per day possible. So if you take your recommendation is 2 portions from this protein shelf per day. If you average that out of chicken one day, beef another day, fish another day, beans the next day, you could calculate a minimum recommendation of 35 grams a day of red meat. We're getting nearly all of our B12 from that red meat portion alone, and that's a very low recommendation that I'm making there. So we've much better chance of achieving nutritional adequacy in our diets when we have a better balance of foods. Again, if we look at the recipes or the foods that we eat, so we don't go into a restaurant and say, will you give me a nice sustainable diet that's culturally appropriate, that's adequate and sustainable, because I think the chef would show you the door and ask you to leave again. But these are things that keep me awake at night when I'm in my kitchen at home making dinner for the family. And as a mum, you have this responsibility to cook a healthy meal, provide all the nutrients for them. And then as a mum who's a nutritionist, they hate me seeing the broccoli come up on the plate all the time and hiding in extra veg into the bolognese. So this is the bolognese that I like to make at home, where I put as much veg into it as possible. And then I have 2 daughters, so the iron is really important in their diet, so there'll be a beef bolognese going on in our house. Once or twice I have attempted this bolognese where I've replaced all of the beef with all of the beans, and one of my daughters can literally surgically extract every bean from the bolognese and not eat it. So now she's not only not getting her iron, she's not getting her protein either. So there's some of the issues that come up. So it's a real balancing act. But what I want to just highlight here is you're seeing about the same amount of calories in both of the bologneses. But you're getting over twice the protein in the beef bolognese. You're getting much more vitamin D, you're getting much more vitamin B12, as well as zinc in the beef bolognese. So per calorie, we're getting a much better nutrient intake in this bolognese. So if you're consuming the bean bolognese, you now have to think of where am I going to get those nutrients from? And that requires careful consideration. So you may be actually consuming a lower carbon footprint bolognese relative to the beef one, but you're getting much better nutrient intakes. And this is where I like to talk about, so that bolognese proportion that takes place in my house is about 3 kilograms. To feed my dog for a day, my beautiful collie, Molly, some of you might have seen pictures of her in presentations I give before. Molly is there for Her Majesty's pleasure. She'll bark at the postman and any potential robbers, so there's a bit of security going on. But I can't eat her. She doesn't produce any food for me. She's not like the hens where you'll get eggs. She's there purely for Her Majesty's pleasure. She costs about 3 kilograms a day to feed in terms of carbon footprint. Sitting back and watching your Netflix movie tonight when you go home and relax after this conference will cost you about 3 kilos. On your TikTok, on your Instagram, you're all costing kilos. So we need to look at it. There's luxuries that we spend our carbon on each day, and then there's necessities. And in my mind, this one is a necessity. One more balancing act, and we saw this again in the last presentation, looking at the difference between milk and cola, or a soft drink like cola. When you pour out a glass of milk to go with your dinner this evening, you're pouring out about 400 grams of CO2, and this is where we're going to disagree on conversion factors. There is a huge range of conversion factors out there. If I talk about 100 mils of milk, no matter what database of nutrient analysis I look to, it'll be around 60 to 65 calories. If I look up the carbon footprint of milk, you'll get anything from about 0.5 to 5 to even 8 kilos per kilo of milk. So the one that I had used here was actually a 2 kilos of carbon per kilo of milk. So that's why we're seeing the 400 grams of carbon there in that glass of milk. But you can see we're getting protein, carbohydrate, fat, more than our daily requirement of B12 and about a third of our calcium requirement in that one glass of milk. When we pour out our glass of cola, we're getting the same amount of carbon. So there's similar carbon footprints with soft drinks and milk. Somewhat less calories, 84 calories, no protein, lots of carbohydrate, but in the form of sugar entirely. No B12, no calcium. Within 3 hours of consuming that glass of milk, you have started to make and regenerate the protein within your body. So we're straight away using it. You literally are what you eat. So that glass of milk, by the time you go to bed tonight, has started to become part of your muscle and is also maintaining that integrity of our bones, and really required in terms of achieving peak bone mass during teenage years and then maintaining our bone mass as we age as well. We're getting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spoons of sugar out of the cola and generally generating a spike in our bloods, and that'll go into fat stores if we don't expend it in the form of exercise. So we've got 2 very different foods up there, but yet they have the same carbon footprint. So we need to look beyond carbon footprint when we're looking at foods. This was a study conducted, it's one of the ones that got me into the space of diet and sustainability when John Hyland was working with me as a postdoc on a Department of Ag funded project. And we looked at, so rather than looking at the nutrient intakes and food group intakes within the Irish population, we converted everything that they were eating to a carbon footprint and then looked at, are there patterns of carbon footprint in the population? So rather than doing a segmentation, you say, here's the low people, here's the high people, we use a cluster analysis, and within cluster analysis, it groups people who are similar together. We're not saying, as researchers, who those groups are, but the data and the statistical analysis decides that. And just looking a little bit closer in those results, we found 3 very distinct groups within the population, and this is using the National Adult Nutrition Survey, which is one of the best food consumption surveys across Europe, if not further afield. And when we looked at the emissions coming from the foods we were eating on a daily basis, we found 3 groups. And we were kind of classifying them similar to that FAO definition of sustainable diets. The first group was about a quarter of the population, and they were getting most of their greenhouse gas emissions from processed foods, savoury snacks, so your pizzas, crisps, and alcohol. And we saw already on the last presentation, the alcohol and wine, unfortunately, are down low on the nutrient per emissions. The second group, this first group, this unsustainable group as well, were less likely to meet their dietary guidelines. So they weren't meeting the fruit and veg guideline, they weren't meeting their fibre guidelines, they were more likely to have higher BMI as well. The next group was what we call nutritionally sustainable, and I suppose they were a bit like your best in show. These were the good ones who were achieving their guidelines, eating the most fruit and veg, fish. They had a somewhat lower red meat intake, and they had the highest dairy intake, and this is about a quarter of the population, and they had the highest number of guidelines. And then we had the culturally sustainable group, your meat and 2 veg, which is very much that cultural Irish diet. That was about half of the population. They had the highest red meat consumption. They had the second highest dairy consumption relative to the sustainable group, and then their starchy staples. Now, if I was a betting woman, I would have said this cultural group had the highest carbon footprint. But when we go to look at them a little bit more closely, this first one, we're seeing the big high peak here is alcohol. And that was one of the biggest drivers. So the most food that they were eating in this unsustainable group, and there were more likely men and younger age groups as well. They were also, we can see that they have high amounts of, so this is the alcohol bar up here. They have high amounts of the savoury snacks, and they have high amounts of the, all of the thing hasn't come through there of all of the foods, but literally you're going from left to right across the food pyramid. So these are the foods we should be eating most of, and these are the ones that we should be eating in limited amounts. With the nutritionally sustainable, we can see the fruit and veg, the starchy staples, and the dairy are all good and high as you would like to see them. Again, they're eating the green bar here is our, the yellow bar here is our red meat. And you also see they're eating the savoury snacks and the alcohol as well. So they're not completely goody two-shoes, but we do see that there's good intake there. And then this culturally sustainable group, you're seeing Not as high a fruit and veg, but we have the starchy staples, we have the dairy consumption, so they're eating well in those categories. Somewhat higher meat, but not drastically higher than the others. But it's the highest of all three. And when we look at the carbon footprint of each of these diets, it's those following that unhealthy pattern that's very much driven by savoury snacks, alcohol, those foods at the very top of the food pyramid, which we're meant to eat in small amounts. The men, this is the analysis just for men. We looked at men and women separately because men have a higher requirement, so men eat more food, so you have a higher dietary carbon footprint. This healthy, sustainable group that we're meeting most of their dietary guidelines had a carbon footprint of 7.7, and then this reduced down to 7.4 in the group that had the highest overall meat consumption. So it's not just about high carbon foods, it's about the combination in which you eat them. And when we looked at this group a little bit more closely, and you can see it in John's paper, they were actually just eating a little bit less of everything. So it wasn't that there was dramatic differences. We're all eating the same foods, but it's the combination and the pattern of how we consume it that actually drives the carbon footprint overall. So we don't need to have a diet devoid of dairy or devoid of meat to have a lower carbon footprint. It's all about balance, but that never hits the headlines. Balance isn't an interesting headline that'll sell papers. They want something a little bit more dramatic than that. So I need to come up with a more dramatic term than balance. You might have a few suggestions for me earlier. This work that's coming out from a recent project that I'm coordinating, funded by the Department of Agriculture, and that's the SUHI Guide. So we're looking at sustainable and healthy dietary guidelines for the Irish population. And a review paper by Ursula Leonard in UCC looked at low-carbon diets and are they nutritionally adequate. And essentially, just to bring that abstract into focus, what she found was that most of these low-carbon diets try and achieve it by reducing intakes of animal source foods. But what happens then is zinc, calcium, iodine, B12, A and D, the ones that we see these foods are good sources of, start to decrease in the diet as well. We see an increase in iron and folate, but that total iron is coming from plant-based sources and it's not necessarily a bioavailable one. We're also, what can happen as well in that scenario is that the phytates and the non-nutritive properties that we see in high-fibre foods can inhibit the absorption of some of our nutrients as well. So our intakes might look good, but what we see is our status, what we're storing in our bodies, can also decrease as well. And that'll happen over time. So you might see over a 10 or 12-week period, everything could stay good, but if you continuously stay on that low nutrient diet, it'll eventually dig into your stores and your stores start to go down. So across the life stages, there are lots of key important times where we really need to prioritise. And we talk about this balancing act again. There are times possibly where we need to prioritise that nutrient piece over the carbon piece. So during pregnancy and preconception, we have increased requirements for folic acid, iron, calcium, vitamin D. And that beautiful bundle of joy can act like a parasite and just drain the maternal resources and stores if they're not getting enough in their diet. So the pregnant mum can have the calcium in her bones can actually be used if there isn't enough calcium in her diet. So it's really important to achieve nutrient intakes during that period. The same in infancy. From birth to 1 year of age, we increase threefold our body weight. It never happens in any other period of life. So adequate nutrition is absolutely critical. And after 6 months, the baby needs iron, and the best source of that iron is through red meat. And that's why the guidelines for infant feeding suggest introducing red meat at about 6 months. Childhood, again, we have high nutrition requirements relative to our body size. Adolescence, we need the iron and calcium to achieve peak bone mass. And then older age becomes really important. And if you think back to that bolognese where we were getting less protein per calories and per portion, that becomes really significant in older age because we actually start to lose our appetite as we age. So we need to get really good nutrient density in smaller portions. And that's to do with if you want to kind of project into the future, what way do you see yourself? Is it a frail old person with the walking frame in the nursing home not able to live independently anymore because you haven't been eating an adequate diet and being told to stop? Or have you got good, strong muscle? and if you do, it will you need to be eating a sustainable diet. So there are periods where possibly that health piece needs to outweigh the sustainability piece. And that brings me to the conclusions of a holistic approach. Is always a good one to put up in the conclusions. We all need to work together on this part. The footprint is to do it foods in the correct proportions, not removing one. Meat and dairy certainly play an essential role. And then the nutrient density piece is really important across all of the age groups. And thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Sinead, and maybe I'll invite you and our other speakers to join me on the stage here, and we can have a short question and answer session. I think we have about 10 minutes or so, if I can steal a couple for Karen. And just to say, in terms of the questions and answers, if when you're asking a question, because we're being live streamed, if you wouldn't mind standing up and waiting for the microphone to appear, and I think Muireann and colleagues have got a roving microphone, stating your question, your name, and then followed by your question. And because we're limited in time, I'm encouraging questions and perhaps not statements, if that's okay. So thank you for the panel for joining us. Have we got any questions if you want to raise your hand? And we've got Carol here in the front, but maybe while I'm waiting for Carol's, I might start with our keynote speaker, and Badi, thank you very much. I was wondering, you've set out a very, I suppose, exploratory global context, but what are the implications from Ireland, from your perspective, from what you've heard?
Well, I think I'm very pleased to say that all what we have presented in the global context in terms of the solutions, I have mentioned a number of challenges, but we know the solutions to these challenges. And really, I'm very pleased that to see in Ireland is they are implementing all these solutions. And we are, as FAO and indicated this a couple of times, we are also using Ireland as a model to implement these solutions in other regions and other countries. So really, this is very, very important for us to follow what Ireland is doing to reduce the environmental impact of the livestock sector. But again, it's important that we bring the debate to the center, not to be very skewed towards environmental aspect.
Thank you for that. Encouraging. Carol, your question?
Yeah, so Carl Richards from the head of the Teagasc Climate Centre. So we've heard a lot about the need for verifiable claims and heard about the metric, I suppose, variation between countries and different approaches. So general question, how can purchasers and consumers trust the data coming from different countries and use that in their purchasing decisions to reduce their footprints?
Laurence, do you want to go? And maybe Deirdre?
You want to go? Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the studies we've looked at is kind of carbon labelling, and it's, I suppose, still not to the forefront of in many markets. We see a bit of it happening in the UK. So I think what we see happening is it's more from the trade customers requiring verification, data auditing of it, as well as the legislative kind of framework being put in place. So increasingly, I think consumers are probably relying on those elements as well. So increasingly, we're seeing the need for the verification of our data points through AgNav from all of the global customers and so on. So, yeah, I think driven by the legislative environment, driven by trade customers, consumers becoming increasingly understanding it, but not really. There's a lot of kind of, I suppose, labelling fatigue around carbon as well, not understanding what one label means versus another. Hence why a lot of these directives are coming in. Is kind of my experience of the marketplace anyway.
And I suppose there is, international standards that we all need to work to, whether, ISO standards for carbon footprinting. But you're right, there are problems there because, there's times when the system is tried to be gamed. And I think for us, is keeping science at the centre, keeping data integrity at the centre, the likes of AgNav, where we have very robust data capture mechanisms and will become more robust over time. That allows us to stand fairly strong on pedestals and be clear on our own data.
Yeah, I do think the trajectory is positive for Ireland because we have that robust kind of data set there over a period of time.
We've got another question here in the front. And if anybody else wants to ask a question, maybe you could tee up the microphone. Anybody else got questions?
Tim.
Tim.
Laurence mentioned the desirability of producing foods in the most sustainable parts of the world. What's the logic of Ireland reducing its carbon footprint by 25% when we could be doubling milk production and meat production and reducing overall world emissions? Logically, now I know the bean counters would have to find some way of getting credit for that, but it seems totally illogical for a country like Ireland to even contemplate reducing production when we are producing at a very low level, and that we could be reducing overall planetary emissions. Now, I have a couple of quick little side questions as well.
Shall we answer that one first and see whether we can see what debate follows, and we'll try and get some more in. Thanks very much, Tim. Laurence, do you want to go on?
I suppose, international treaties say that we use a territory approach to count emissions for agriculture. So it's basically we're counting it at a national level, Tim, and our legislative requirement is to reduce that by 25%. For us, I think if we can work really hard and continue on the journey to create technologies that allow us to do that without reducing the food production, that's our objective, to essentially continue to develop those technologies, help farmers implement them on the ground, so that we can reduce the emissions, hit those targets without having to reduce food production.
It makes no sense to talk about reducing it if you're not relating it to what we're doing overall in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And Badi, maybe you want to comment on that in your global context, because you set out the figures at the outset.
Yeah, this is very, I think, very important point. What we see, for example, in terms of emission, and it was really clear in the figures that showed earlier, we see that in developed countries, the livestock system in developed countries, they emit less carbon than in developing countries, mainly because of the better management, better genetics. But our purpose is that to work both to support developing countries to reduce their emission. But this is the divide between developed world and developing world. And then the question of, I think it was mentioned earlier, we should provide food or animal source food in an environment where that's more suited for livestock production. But this is the response for that is quite difficult. In the sense, there is also national sovereignty and national food security policy. Countries just do not accept that to outsource their food from another countries. So it's a question that is very difficult to solve.
I think we've got another question here in the front. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. My name is Una Duggan, and I work at Birdwatch Ireland. And I just wanted to ask Deirdre, well, I have two questions for two panellists, but Deirdre, just in relation to farmland birds, and your very interesting talk about, reporting and the metrics. Birdwatch Ireland, our data shows that farmland birds are the fastest declining bird group in Ireland, and even some common species like the common kestrel and common snipe are now becoming critically endangered. So how will Board BIA reflect what are the trends that we see in the data, and how will you communicate that? And then my question is for Sinead, another one. And the recommended intake of protein, you said, is 35 grams of red meat in a day. And what is the actual average in Ireland of red meat intake, and how does that work? How does it match?
Do you want to go first, Deirdre? Or?
Yeah, sure. So in Borbia specifically, we work with our assurance programs on farm level and with companies. So we would work with about our membership of about 77,000 farmers on the various different sustainability and quality assurance programs. So increasingly, we're bringing in more metrics around and requirements around, and it's in discussion at the moment, bringing biodiversity, environmental footprinting, and topics like those. So those are all in discussions at the moment, will be rolled out next year. So there's a number of areas that we're kind of focused on in terms of biodiversity there. On the company side, we work with about 340 companies around their sustainability plans through the Origin Green programme, and work with a number of biodiversity organisations again around having a national biodiversity officer that supports those companies implement plans in their companies around biodiversity, pollinators and other areas. So while metrics and certain topics are I suppose maybe not where they need to be, there's certainly an effort in the organisation to kind of try and develop and improve continuously, and the collaboration with Teagasc and ICBF around AgNav has an action planner tool within the kind of assessment of environmental metrics, and biodiversity is very much a part of that action planner that farmers can take and choose around. So biodiversity very much at the centre, but as you said, increasingly needs to be a focal point.
And one of the topics this afternoon is biodiversity, so we'll have a paper on that later. But just briefly then, Sinéad, your
so the 35 comes from a calculation of 2 portions of meat per day over the 7 days. So if you can average out a couple of those days being red meat, you're probably looking at 35 grams a day. We're there or thereabouts. We're not enormously over it. It depends on the subgroup. So if you take the entire population as a whole, it's about 35 grams a day, not significantly over it. But then you're going to have some groups who eat a lot more and some groups who eat a lot less. So we're not far exceeding our subgroup, our meat consumption. But what's really important to add as well, though, I was brought up in Laurence's talk about the water footprint. So, like, my presentation focused only on the carbon footprint, but we need to look at them collectively. And when you look at the water footprint, it's the plant-based foods that are actually really bad from that perspective. So we need to take a number of environmental metrics together. And if I could pick up even on Carl's question on the labelling as well, and I think it's potentially a disaster in the making, because it depends on what environmental metric you're going to take. Yeah. If I am a farmer and I stick a few, what the words are escaping me, the solar panels on my shed, can I now claim that I have a lower environmental footprint of my product? So I think we need to look at on more than one environmental metric. We need to bring in the nutrient value of the foods as well. If we go down that front of pack nutrition labelling that has been done before, it's probably a disaster. And I think it needs to even maybe bring in some of the EFSA health claims like approach to the labelling that you can actually prove and verify. So I just wanted to add
I think we have, the microphone has reached one final question. Is that correct? Oh, we've got 2 here, so we'll take them quickly maybe together, and then we'll wrap it up to try and get to your coffee break. So perhaps the gentleman on the left, my left, so there.
Hi, I'm Charles Stanley-Smith, I'm an environmentalist. This today is a lovely, happy, clappy thing about how good agriculture is and all of that. We heard on the news this morning about the SEAI saying we're going to miss 2030 targets by 20%, and that sort of just got glossed over. You know, when is everybody, I'm not just saying agriculture, this is not an attack on agriculture, but when is everybody going to actually realise the critical nature of this, what's happening to us? And the reason why this is important to agriculture, you've seen Valencia for the past couple of days. You've seen the amount of mud in Valencia. Where did that come from? I bet you it came from all the local farms getting drained into Valencia. That is one of the things that we're looking at. And can we please now begin to actually understand this is critical, this is not all if we do this. I mean, the MAC curves, if we do this, we do that, we do this, and do that, and do that, we might just make it. let's have some sense in this, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And our second question, we'll come back to that in terms of transformation and urgency.
Thanks, Chair. Vincent Roddy, Irish and Chair of the Hill Farmers Association. Just to follow on from a question that was outlined earlier as regards carbon, I know today and tomorrow we're going to have the results, maybe by the end of the week, of the presidential elections in the United States. And if the bookers are to be believed, we could be looking at a Donald Trump presidency for the next 4 years. And he has indicated that if his first action as president will be to take the United States out of the Paris Climate Accord. So if that happens, then what I want to know is, you know, when you look as well what happened with China and the BRIC countries and all that, and their non-involvement in this, can Europe continue on the current path? And can Europe food remain competitive with the high level of regulation that is there? And I know, as Deirdre has said, like, it is burdensome, and that's putting it mildly. So can Europe food and Irish food obviously remain competitive in a global market where other countries don't have those regulations?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for those. So I think the first question, first speaker, was very much around the transformation and the urgency around that. And maybe, Badi, you could speak about perhaps some of, you know, the transformative actions that we all need to address.
Yeah, I think what I have introduced here, especially the work what we are doing in FAO on the development of sustainable livestock transformation framework, and we are taking this a step further. And this is actually a request by member countries, and most of European countries have asked FAO to develop a global plan of action for sustainable livestock transformation. And the purpose is that to bring everybody on board on the same issues. Of course, when it comes to implementation, it will be left to the countries to implement according to their needs and priority and own context. But having a framework that on which everybody agrees and start to having, even in the second stage, indicators on which regions and countries can report on, I think it's a big step towards a common goal. And I think you have indicated in your conclusion that this should not be discussed, only a discussion at national level or European level. It has to be brought at the global level, and this is what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and just go back to, you know, we're on the journey of the 25% reduction by 2030 relative to 2018. You know, we had 4.6% reduction last year, 2.9% relative to 2018. So it's not easy, but I think that we all have to go on that journey, you know. So I suppose one thing that probably hasn't been talked about and probably isn't going to be talked about a huge amount today is climate change adaptation, and Valencia is part of that story. I think we have to keep that at the forefront of our minds as we channel. We had a presentation in the last couple of weeks from Met Éireann around what we expect to happen around climate from an Irish point of view, and we need to build that into our thought process as we look at our systems going forward while we reduce overall emissions.
And Deirdre, I'm going to ask you to address the European context.
Yeah, and hopefully we aren't facing into an ESG kind of climate denial election tomorrow. But yeah, no, it certainly is. I mean, a challenge if the US isn't following suit. There are regs that have come in Europe, but backtracking on that, and will probably particularly relate to fossils as well as agriculture. We have seen that kind of happen in the US a little bit more from a European perspective. I suppose, you know, we need to remain competitive. We need to keep the social sustainability elements to the forefront as well as the economic. And while some of these kind of regulations that I mentioned teasing through are going to be a burden for a couple of years, and everything else, we would hope that a lot of the sustainability, and Laurence can probably speak to this more, a lot of the MAC measures are economically better measures as well as sustainable, more sustainable. And I think, you know, focusing on those management practices is going to be important in a European context. But I don't think from a European perspective, while there's a bedding down of a lot of those regulations, the Green Deal is there. The approach is taken, and I think it's really trying to find the competitiveness in that rather than any sort of backtrack like the US. But we're always going to have to compete against other nations, other countries, and it's really just about finding those proof points that we can show the market. A lot of, I said, as you see, a lot of our produce goes to the UK. 34%, I think, mentioned goes to the UK and other international markets. So while the US is an important market for us, we have a diversified marketplace that is looking for sustainability.
So I appreciate there are other questions coming. Sorry, Badi, just one very succinct point.
I just wanted to add one thing. Actually, this week, there is a regional conference in Latin America to discuss exactly this, what we are discussing here today. So this debate is not taking only place in Europe. It's taking place in other regions. They are asking the same type of questions. And this week we have this conference, regional conference in Latin America. Next week I'm going to Asia to have a similar conference. So this is as I said, this is a journey where we see all regions are willing to take part of this journey.
So thank you very much. Appreciate there are other questions, and maybe you'd like to catch up with our speakers during the coffee break, which is well overdue. But in the usual fashion, I'd really like to thank our speakers from the really informative session and also for addressing all the questions. Thank you very much.